Alright, so I just saw Furiosa, so I'm going to talk about the Mad Max films as a whole first. The first Mad Max film is very obviously a low budget film. You can really see it stretch itself to try and reach feature length. You can see a lot of glaring issues that are obviously budgetary related. I think what's interesting about that film is that it's commendable how successful it was given how little resources they clearly had. And George Miller, as a director, he was able to put a creative spin on it, which livened it up a bit, through the editing and through the characters and the overall aesthetic of it, which livens it up and makes it feel more organic. Miller definitely had a vision of what he was doing. And I think what's most interesting about the first film is that the post-apocalyptic setting was an afterthought, which they put in to excuse why parts of it looked so empty and barren. And I think that's funny because the post-apocalyptic setting would go on to become the series' most defining feature. And not only that, the franchise would go on to become the most defining post-apocalyptic franchise out there. So the original film, it's not great on its own. It's very flawed. You kind of view it as more of as an artifact than as a piece of entertainment. The second one, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, I've heard that when that got released, people didn't even know it was a sequel, and I can kind of see why, because the first one isn't very very exciting. This one, the dystopian post-apocalyptic wasteland, feels way more realized, and it goes much harder into it as well with the aesthetics of it, like how kind of gnarly and messed up the characters look. They look really dirty, and they're all wearing this weird armor that they clearly just found, like they're just wearing bits and pieces of stuff that they've scavenged. This film is a huge improvement over the first one, but I do think the pacing isn't the best. The first hour of this movie just isn't really that great, and it kind of is just kind of a campy 80s action film. But then the last, I think, 30 minutes, it turns into this climactic set piece, which I think really makes the movie for me. It's fantastic. You can see why this movie is so beloved. The final action set piece is just so ridiculously over the top and entertaining and visceral. The third film then was Beyond Thunderdome, which I think is the weakest out of the franchise, and I think a lot of people would agree with me. What Beyond Thunderdome kind of falters with is that tonally, it's a much more campy, cheesy, lighthearted film. It feels like they're trying to replicate Star Wars. The action just suffers from it because it's more goofy, it's more silly. It feels very tame. I like certain parts of it. I like the character Master Blaster. I like the concept of two characters existing in like a symbiotic relationship. But yeah, this movie again, for the most part, it's very dull. It's too lighthearted, and the action set piece at the end is just too underwhelming to make it a satisfying experience as a whole. And then I think it was like 35 years later, the 2010s were huge for belated sequels and reboots and remakes and restarts and whatever. So then we got Mad Max Fury Road, and that is arguably one of the greatest action films ever made. I feel like it almost deserves its own video because of how great it is. It is an insanely impressive film. It is absolutely mind-blowing what they achieved with that. It's just an emphasis on practical effects, and then the fact that they did it practically is incredible, because how the hell did you even make that? And you hear about how troubled the production was with cast and crew getting mugged, Tom Hardy and Charlize Theron having like falling outs, and I think they fell out with George Miller as well. And I think I've seen reports that they'd spend a day shooting and they'd only get 2 seconds of usable footage. And there's so much to talk about, how great the editing is in it and how great the sound design is. It almost is a miracle that it all just comes together in a cohesive way, like that there's sense made out of this chaos. It's really boundary pushing, I think, in what it did, and I think it has deservedly gone down as one of the best films of the 2010s. And so now we're on to Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, if you want the full title. And in order to understand Furiosa, you kind of have to understand Fury Road. Furiosa is a different beast entirely to Mad Max Fury Road, and I can't blame the filmmakers for taking a new direction. Fury Road is great because it's this insane filmmaking achievement that is unlike anything else ever made. It would have been difficult to recapture the magic of Fury Road, plus it would have been a hellish ordeal for George Miller and company. The fact that this film obviously veers away from Fury Road's manic presentation proves how much of a miracle that film was. And it's not like they completely phoned this film in either. Like, remember, I'm comparing it to what is arguably the best action film ever made. This will probably go down as the best action film 2024 has to offer. The action scenes are just as visceral and as exciting as the ones in Fury Road. There's just a lot of downtime in between. The action is phenomenal. Like, there are parts where I just didn't want it to end. Loved all the crazy weapons and vehicles that were on display. There's a lot to appreciate with George Miller's directing. Little details are added, like how characters interact with weapons and vehicles and machinery, which gives the impression that they're deeply familiar with this fictional world. There's a scene where characters take time to scrounge for resources while under fire, and it helps emphasize the type of survival instincts they have. There's so much variety in the color palette and lighting, making the franchise appear as vibrant as it ever has. The weather almost acts as a disembodied antagonist, with sandstorms imposing a dramatic presence on the film, even when they're at a distance. This thing also has crystal clear sound effects editing, which is exactly what you'd want from an action spectacle like this. While it's not as aggressive as in Fury Road, the editing helps glue action scenes together into tight, cohesive sequences. Chris Hemsworth stands out here, possibly being a career best. He transforms into the role, bringing much needed balance to a character that is both charismatic and volatile. Anya Taylor-Joy perfectly captures the character of Furiosa, making her performance feel consistent with Charlize Theron's. Speaking of recast roles, I'm going to pronounce this guy's name wrong. Lachi Hulme is cast in the role of Immortan Joe. He certainly looks the part and is able to appropriately recapture the intensity of Hugh Key's burn. The voice sounded a bit off, but that's about it. Tom Burke is solid. Probably the first movie he's in where he's not the best part. He didn't have much of a character to play, which is a shame because he has a lot of talent to flex. Also, I've been saying since 2019 that Tom Burke is an underrated actor. Like, let the record show that I've been there before everyone else. With Burke finally getting some exposure, he's probably going to be in an Oscar-winning role before the decade is out anyway. This film is far from perfect and it has some glaring flaws. As I said before, the filmmakers didn't replicate Fury Road's grueling practical effects, so there are several shots here that heavily use green screens and CGI. A lot of these shots don't look real. Like, to be fair, they have such a consistent aesthetic that some of them have a stylish feel, and Fury Road also has shots that look like this. However, there are some shots that look terrible. I had seen some screenshots floating around and I thought they were edited, but no, the film actually looks like a clickbait YouTube thumbnail at points. I had seen some people compare the visuals to The Flash, and I disagree because these ugly shots are only fleeting in Furiosa, whereas they make up the entirety of The Flash. Plus, the vast majority of Furiosa looks pristine, with these jarring visuals cropping up infrequently. There's one part that I think is a plot hole. It involves a character escaping despite being surrounded by hundreds of henchmen. I have no idea how no one saw them. There's a moment of fan service that made me roll my eyes. Gastown has a giant moat of oil surrounding it, yet its guards use flamethrowers. It looks cool, but isn't that infringing upon OSHA regulations? What I like most about this film is that it's probably the best prequel film. It stays away from mindless fan service for the most part. It expands upon the world in an organic, substantial way, and it can stand on its own without relying on its precursor. I hope George Miller makes a million more Mad Max movies. This whole review could have just been about how great the action scenes were, and I think this is a worthy successor to Fury Road, even though it's not as much of a technical achievement as that film was. And I'm feeling a 8 out of 10 on Furiosa.